talking about is, when we talk about species coexisting, then we think about species coexistence being mediated by partitioning along the resource axis or the habitat axis, basically the space axis. And not so much is known about temporal or partitioning along the time axis. And the reason for this is that the temporal partitioning along the temporal axis is much more difficult because species need to evolve special adaptations, especially if you're talking about partitioning along the day-night axis, then species need to have special adaptations that enable them to be active at low light levels. So there is a whole suite of adaptations that are required. For example, they need to have special visual adaptations, olfactory, they need to maybe have better olfactory adaptations and so on in order to move into the night environment. So therefore, this is what makes temporal partitioning very, very interesting. And especially when you talk about partitioning from the day to the night. Okay, there are several species that might partition within the day. Some start early their activity, some start later. But here today, what we are going to discuss is mainly a case where the partitioning happens along the day-night axis, which means there are bees that have moved from the daytime into the night environment. So what we're going to try and see in this talk is why did this temporal partitioning along the day-night axis occur? So, or in other words, why did nocturnality evolve in bees? And how is nocturnality facilitated in bees? So we are going to be looking at adaptations for a nocturnal lifestyle in bees and what prompts them to become nocturnal. So these are the two things on which I'm going to center my talk today, very briefly. So in our lab, we look at, nocturnal bees, right? We look at diurnal bees and then we compare them with nocturnal bees. We're also interested in a totally different talk that I'm not going to be talking about today, which is miniaturization. What happens when body size becomes really, really small? Okay, but that is a different talk. Today, I'm going to just stick to nocturnal bees. So you can see here that nocturnal, if you were to plot, right, bees with body size, and you see that nocturnality mainly occurs in the larger body sized bees. Okay, there are very, very few tiny bees that have evolved nocturnality. But so there appears to be a body size bias when you talk about nocturnal bees. And here is a picture of a carpenter bee, which is the system that I'm going to be talking to you about today. And so what is the issue? Let us look at what is the issue with nocturnality in bees. So all of us have seen this picture at some point of time. Okay, so it's a famous textbook kind of a picture. As you know, most insects, all insects, including bees, have the compound eyes, which is very different from our eye. What we have is called the camera eye, right? And the issue with compound eyes is that, the resolution in compound eyes is not great. Okay, so this is the first thing that limits, dim light vision using compound eyes. Now, what happens is that if you were to imagine, just take an analogy where, let's say, humans had a compound eye, if that were the case, then you would, in order to see just as well as we do, with a kind of human visual resolution, then you would need a compound eye which is of that size. It needs to be a really, really huge eye in order to be able to see as clearly as humans do. Now, so then what happens? What is the issue? Okay, in compound eyes, as the eye size gets smaller, then you have fewer ommatidia. Ommatidia are, for those who are not familiar, you see these hexagonal units, right? Each of them are called ommatidia. In layman's terms, we also call them as islets, right? So each ommatidia, okay, the number of ommatidia becomes fewer, and the number of the ommatidial diameters. And why is diameter critical is because the diameter of each of those hexagonal ommatidia that you see here is going to define or is going to regulate the amount of light that the eye receives. Okay, so as you make the compound eye smaller and smaller, there's going to be a reduction in both of these, in the ommatidial number as well as in the ommatidial diameter. And so that is going to constrain vision at low light levels. So before I jump into nocturnal bees, let's just take a look at the eyes of bees. What kind of eyes do they have? Yes, they have compound eyes, but they are capable of color vision. We know that bees visit flowers of all colors, and we know that they possess a UV, a blue, and a green receptor. Okay, now that is different from what we have. We have a blue and a green. We don't have a UV receptor. Instead, what we have is a red receptor. So bees have an extra UV receptor, but most bees lack a red receptor. And what this essentially means is that, as you can see in the picture, a flower that appears yellow to humans actually has some very interesting patterns through the bee's eyes when viewed through the bee's eyes. And these kind of patterns will help the bee to actually make very guided landings on a flower, and also to find where the rewards are in flowers, where the nectar guide is, and where the nectar is present, and so on and so forth. So it makes them, make precise landings, as well as to, efficiently extract rewards from flowers. Now, most bees, as I started out by saying, most bees are diurnal, and we know a lot from the work of Carl von Frisch, who won the Nobel Prize in 1973 for his work on the bee dance. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the bee dance, so I'm not going to get into details of the bee dance. But from Carl von Frisch's work, from after that, there was a lot of interest in bees, and people, there are a lot of groups across the world that have studied bees in great detail, mainly the honeybees. But from that, we know that the bees are capable of using the sun as a compass. Yes, hello?
Hello.
Yeah, sorry to disturb you.
Yeah.
Actually, we cannot view the slide either on the Google Meet, neither or on the YouTube also. So, can you just share the screen again and scroll down the slides if you can? Sorry,
Yeah.
yeah. Now,
Now,
now it is visible apparently. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry to
So you
disturb.
couldn't see any of the slides from the beginning?
No, that was the problem. The only one first slide was displaying over there. I thought it will be scrolled, but it was not in fact.
Okay, so it appears, I think the problem is that when I go into full screen mode, then, there is an issue. But if I keep it like this, so then I
okay.
think you're able to see it. So let me
Yeah, that,
keep it
Then
like
it's fine.
that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. No problem.
Yeah.
it's clear.
So,
It's clear.
yeah. So what I was trying to say here is that after Carl von Frisch's work on, where he discovered the dance of the bees, there has been a lot of interest in bees, and many groups across the globe have been working on bee behavior. And from all that work put together, decades and decades of work, we now know that, for example, we know that honeybees can use the sun as a compass. We know that they can use landmarks in order to navigate, because they go long distances from the hive in order to find food sources. And we also know that they can locate flowers using various cues. They can use vision, they can use olfactory cues. For example, within the visual domain, they can use color, pattern, shape, and so on. We also know that much more recent research has shown that they can use temperature as a cue. They can use electric fields as a cue, and so on and so forth. So they use multiple cues when they try to locate and feed from flowers. Now, most of these bees also stop flying at sunset, but today we are going to discuss dim light bees. And dim light bees are those bees that continue to forage even though the light levels go down after sunset. Okay. Now, these dim light species have evolved in many bee families, as you can see in this, in the phylogeny over here. You can see here that the dotted line are those families, bee families, that contain obligate as well as facultative dim light species. And the solid lines are those families that contain only diurnal species. Okay. And so today we are going to be talking about bees within the family Apidae. Okay, this is also the family which has honeybees, but we are not talking about honeybees today. We are talking about carpenter bees. So why is this interesting? As I said, within phase shifts, when you talk about temporal partitioning, within phase shifts, for example, within the day, whether an animal starts its activity earlier in a day or later in a day, such shifts are pretty common. But here we are talking about a phase inversion shift, where the activity actually switches, or bees have evolved from, diurnality, which is a common condition, into nocturnality. And such cases are rare, and basically because of the accompanying physiological adaptations and the sensory adaptations that are required in order to make this face inversion shift. So here is the eye of a bee. If you were to look at the cross section of the eye of a bee, this is what you would see. So each of these units that you can see, these curved surfaces, represents one single ommatidia, and the light, you can see the light which passes through each of them has a lens, okay, which is defined by the diameter of these ommatidia, and the light passes through the lens and then is collected in the rhabdoms, the underlying rhabdoms. Okay, the rhabdoms have the photoreceptor cells. Okay, so what happens is that this kind of eye design is typical of diurnal insects. Each of these individual ommatidia are separated from each other by screening pigments. The yellow that you see in between are screening pigments, and that prevents light from entering into multiple ommatidia. So essentially, the light that is received by a rhabdom is essentially the light that passes through a single ommatidial lens. Okay. So now what happens is that when it is bright light and there are plenty of photons, there is no issue, because the rhabdoms are going to receive abundant photons, which makes it very possible to see during bright light. But when photons become rarer, like it happens at night, so then this kind of an eye design is not going to be very effective. So what has happened over evolution is that there is this second kind of compound eye, and this is called the superposition compound eye. And this is mainly found in animals or insects that are active at night or at low light levels. Now, in this case, the main difference in the structure is that you can see that the screening pigments are withdrawn, right? And so essentially what happens is that a rhabdom can receive light from several neighboring ommatidia. In some species, it can be hundreds and even, several hundreds of ommatidia that the rhabdom can receive light from. Okay. Now, therefore, what happens as a consequence of this kind of an eye design, the superposition eye, the eye becomes much more sensitive at night. It can see much better at low light levels, essentially because of this, that you have a clear zone, as a result of which the light that passes through several ommatidia can converge and be received on a rhabdom, making the signal that much brighter. Okay, so this the apposition eye in the earlier slide is typical of diurnal insects, but the superposition eye is typical of nocturnal insects, like you have in the case of moths and beetles. Now, bees have the former eye design, which is the apposition eye, which if you look at the optics of it, then it should not be very effective under low light levels. And this is what we are going to discuss, that despite the constraints of the apposition eye, how is it that some species have turned nocturnal? Okay. And to answer this question, we are looking at this system, which is the carpenter bee system. These are coexisting species in the Western Ghats and also in central India. So what you have here is the first species, which is Leucothorax. Xylocopa is the genus of carpenter bees, and Leucothorax is a completely diurnal beast. It starts its activity with the sun and ends its activity with the sunset. You have Tenuis carpa, second species, which is largely diurnal. It can sometimes turn nocturnal, but within a particular period. And then you have the third species, which is Cranibarica. And Cranibarica is active at low light levels. That is, it starts its activity about half an hour after sunset and continues all through the night. It stops its activity just before sunrise. Now, those of you who are not familiar with carpenter bees, they nest in wood like this, okay, in dead tree, branches of trees. And you can see that these are the nests. And if you were to take a cross section of the nest, this is what the tunnels would look like. And here is a picture of a bee, which is sitting outside the nest. And a single female would actually provision by collecting pollen and nectar and lay the eggs inside and take care of the, the developing brood by herself. So it's quite different from honeybees in that respect. So when we compare these three species, okay, So you have the first diurnal species. You can see that it starts and ends its activity at bright light, okay, which is approximately less than half an hour after sunset. It would stop becoming active. The second species, on the other hand, is is Tenuis carpa, which is also diurnal, but it can extend a bit into the nocturnal time periods. Okay, but it can't go as into starlight levels as the third species can. Tranquibarica is the obligately nocturnal species. It starts its activity at about half an hour after sunset, and it goes all the way down to starlight. When I say starlight, what I mean is a moonless night, like a new moon night, where the light levels are extremely low. Okay. We have parallels in honeybees. As you know, we have several species of honeybees in India, in much of Asia. And most of these honeybees are diurnal, but there is this one species called Apis dorsata, or those of you who know Apis dorsata, the giant honeybee. This is active sometimes during nocturnal time periods. And if you were to look at the next slide, you can see the activity with respect to hours of the day. On the x-axis, you have hours of the day. And you can see that the first species, which is called the dwarf honeybee, it starts and ends its activity, or rather it confines its activity between 6 and 6, right? 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., more or less, roughly. Same thing with Serrana, which is the eastern honeybee. And dorsata, on the other hand, you can see that there are some times of the year, not always, but there are some times of the year, like in the month of February and in the month of April in this study site, when it can extend into nocturnal time periods. So it can be active at quite low light levels. However, we did not find activity at light levels lower than half moon. Okay, so it mainly is restricted to some months of the year when certain flowers are in bloom, and also to light intensities between full moon and a half moon. Now, what are the limitations of low light? As I was mentioning earlier, the main issue is that photon capture becomes low, and it also becomes very unreliable. And what this means essentially is that the signal to noise ratio declines or decreases, okay? And as a result of which signals become very poor, okay? Or you can't distinguish signal from noise. If you were to look at these 4 squares over here, okay, there is a black object of different sizes over here on the top left. And when the photon capture is high, you can clearly make out the size and shape of these objects. You can see that they are of different sizes and and so on. Now, if you were to think of unreliable photon capture, okay, or when the signal to noise ratio declines, as you have on the top right, you can see that you can still make out this size and shape of these objects. When it becomes even poorer, as you have in the bottom left, so then you see that, yeah, it is still possible, but you can see that your smaller objects begin to disappear, or it begins to get lost in the noise. When it becomes really low, the signal to noise ratio or your photon capture rates are very low. So then you can barely see the object. And this is exactly what happens when you have an apposition eye, which cannot capture enough photons at night to make the signal more stronger. Okay. And so now what I've done is I've defined the problem to you. And now let us look at, therefore, what are the solutions to this? Because they have turned nocturnal, and how have they done it is the question. So the first thing is, let us look at the sensory adaptations. And when I say sensory, I'm mainly concentrating on the visual adaptations in this particular case. The first thing that we did is that we had these experiments that were done at night, which is to see whether these bees can actually detect landmarks at night. And what do we mean by a landmark? Okay, what you see in these films here is the nest of a bee on a tree log, okay, and over which what we did is, over the nest entrance, like I showed you earlier, we placed a very prominent paper landmark. This was a white landmark which was placed over the entrance of the nest with a hole in the center, which allowed the bee to go in and out, and you can see the tracks of flying bees. We allowed the bee to get used to this new landmark for a few days. And then what we did is, one fine evening, after the bee had flown out of the nest, then we change the position of this landmark to either to the top or to the side or to the bottom. Okay, and then we wait till the bees come back home after a foraging trip, and then we look at what is the flight path. And what you see here at the bottom left is the flight path of a returning bee, where the landmark is displaced to the top. The nest entrance is indicated by the circle. So what has happened in this case is that the bee has learned to associate, after some exposure of a few nights, that the landmark is associated with the nest hole. And what she does is that she flies directly at the landmark and tries to enter the nest, thinking that the nest is behind there. On the right again, what you see is the very, is the confused flight path of a bee that doesn't find her nest hole over the landmark. So essentially what this tells us is that two things. One is that they can use, landmarks to detect small, a small cavity in a tree log. And secondly, it tells us that the, even though the contrast between the background tree and the landmark is low, yet at low light levels, they are able to detect. Okay. So this tells us that they do rely on visual cues. In this particular work, what we've done is then we looked at this process is called homing, returning back home, right? So we looked at how do they home on full moon nights, half moon nights, on first quarter and third quarter nights. And what we found is that they were able to do this quite effectively no matter what the light levels were at night. Okay, so they're pretty good across the lunar cycle at doing this particular task. So then what we did is we looked at the morphology and the anatomy of the bee's eyes. Now on the top, you have the diurnal species, which is indicated by this bracket D in brackets, leucothorax. The middle is the facultatively diurnal / crepuscular bee, and you have the nocturnal bee at the bottom. So what you can see over here is that these are roughly bees of the same size. They're all large bees of the same, roughly of the same size. You can see that the eyes of the nocturnal bee are much larger, more spherical, right, than the eyes of the two diurnal species. Okay, so if you look at the ratio of the eye size to the body size, it tends to be much larger in the case of the nocturnal bee at the bottom as compared to the two diurnal species. The second thing that will be obvious here is that you see these three structures in the middle, in between these two eyes, the left and the right eye. Okay, now these structures are called ocelli, and you can see that the ocelli, the three ocelli, the central and the two, ocelli on the top, are sort of small in the two diurnal species, but they are enormous in the nocturnal species. And also you can see that there is a difference in the orientation. These ocelli are like simple eyes. Okay, they are not like compound eyes, they are like simple eyes. They have an underlying lens which is very poorly focused, so it's not very good, very well resolved vision, but they can make out which is the brighter side and which is the darker side. For example, it is thought that as ocelli are thought to mediate flight or to regulate flight in bees or other flying insects. And this upward orientation seems to suggest that they are probably, in the nocturnal species, they are probably using the light that comes from the top in order to keep their flight balanced or oriented. Okay. Then when you look at the honeybees, and if you compare the Apis, the dwarf honeybee, and the eastern honeybee with the rock or the giant honeybee, you can see that the rock honeybee, which can be facultatively nocturnal, has much larger eyes when compared to the other two species, and you can also see the same adaptation where their ocelli are oriented upwards, and it's also much larger than in the other two species. So this tells us that these are some common adaptations that are associated with dim light foraging in bees. So next what we did is that we looked at the rhabdums. You remember that the rhabdums, for those of you who are not familiar, you will remember that in the first slide I had introduced that the rhabdums are the structures that house the photoreceptor cells. So, and the size of the rhabdums, the length and the diameter of the rhabdums will define the number of photons that are captured. So, of course, if you're a dim light bee, then you want to capture as many photons as possible, and so therefore you would want to make your rhabdoms wider and also longer. Okay, and so that is exactly what you see over here. In the Apis system, you see that Apis dorsata, the facultatively nocturnal giant honeybee, has the widest rhabdoms as compared to the two diurnal species. The same, you can see the same adaptation in the case of carpenter bees, where Xylocopa trancubarica, which is the nocturnal species, has a rhabdom which is much wider than the other two species. Okay, so again, this seems to be an adaptation that is common to species or to bee species that turn to a nocturnal lifestyle. So this is a chart here, and I mean, this is a table here, and from this table, there are certain things that I'll point out to you. We don't have to go through all the numbers. So first of all, if you were to look at the eye to body size ratio, that is the highest, which means that for a given body size, the eye size is largest for X-tran, which is the nocturnal species in this carpenter bee system. And you also see the similar adaptation in the case of the in Apis dorsata, which is the dim light species in the Apis or the honeybee system. If you were to look at the number of ommatidia also called facets, the number of facets is much higher in the nocturnal species of carpenter bee and also in the honeybee species. Now, if you were to look at the diameter of the facet or the ommatidia, you can see that they have much larger diameters, which allows for more photons to be captured or for more light to enter the eye as compared to the two diurnal species. You find the similar thing happening in the case of Apis. Now, rhabdom diameter, we've already seen the electron microscopy figures. In the earlier slide, you can see that in the nocturnal species, the rhabdom is 3 times wider than in the case of the diurnal species. Same with the rhabdom length. The rhabdom length is much longer in the nocturnal species as compared to the diurnal species. Now, I don't have the time to explain what is an acceptance angle and all of that, but you can take it from me that if you were to look at the last row, which is calculating this parameter called optical sensitivity, which is a parameter that estimates how sensitive is your eye at low light levels, you see that the nocturnal carpenter bee has an eye that is 27 times more sensitive than the eye of Leucothorax, which is the strictly diurnal species, and its eye is also 9 times more sensitive than the eye of Tenuis carpa, which is the other diurnal species. And you can see the same thing happening in the Apis system or the honeybee system. So from all of this, what we can conclude is that there seem to be these very specific adaptations to a nocturnal lifestyle. I don't think I have the time to get into interommatidial angles, but what this essentially means is that the interommatidial angle is essentially the angle between two neighboring ommatidia. And if you have an eye that is closely packed in terms of the ommatidia, okay, or the size of the ommatidia, then you have many more ommatidia, numbers of ommatidia, and that makes the eye much more, gives the eye a much greater resolution than, the eyes that have much bigger interommatidial angles, which gives the eye much more sensitivity. So let's not get into these details right now because I don't think I have the time for that. So I'm quickly going into this slide, which sort of summarizes the, what I've discussed so far. That in dim light bees, we see the following adaptations, and that is, we see that they have very large eyes. We see that they have large ommatidial lenses or large ommatidial diameters. We also see that they have wide and long rhabdoms, which contain the photoreceptors. We also see that they have very large acceptance angles and they have very large ocelli. So all of these are optical adaptations that we have seen in dim light bees, and this is true not only in the case of carpenter bees, but also in the case of other dim light bees that have been studied for their visual adaptations. Okay. Now the question is, is this enough for a bee to be able to see at night? These are remarkable adaptations, but is it enough for it to be active? For instance, we see that it's active at starlight levels. Okay. So what else do they have? it is very likely, and we know from work on other dim light species, that they do have neural adaptations. And what are those neural adaptations? They have something which is called spatial pooling, okay, and they also have temporal pooling and spectral pooling. So what this essentially means is that in the case of spatial pooling, what happens is that let me see if I have the slides over here. No, okay, I'm not going to discuss those things, but just to tell you what is spatial pooling. So essentially what this means is that the eye is able to sum signals from adjacent ommatidia in order to get a much stronger signal. But as a consequence of this, what happens is that the eye loses out in terms of resolution, how fine they can see objects. Temporal pooling is when they slow down the response time of the photoreceptors in order to see or to get a brighter image, and it comes at some cost. Okay, it comes at the cost of slowing down vision, which is not very good for nocturnal insects or flying nocturnal insects. The third is probably they can do spectral pooling. So essentially, what happens is that if you were to look at the color vision in bees, and the first person who showed color vision in bees is Carl von Frisch. And what he did was he had bees trained to visit sucrose solution that was presented in the middle of a checkerboard. And these checkerboards either were, different shades of gray, or it was a blue square which contained rewards. So he trained bees to associate sucrose rewards with a blue color. And then in tests, what he did is he presented the bee with all of these choices where they were in different shades of gray or blue. And the assumption is that if the bee has learned color, then it should visit the blue square and not visit the other grays. Okay. Now, like I showed you earlier, bees are capable of color vision, right? They have a UV, a blue, and a green receptor. And the way they see these different colors is by comparing the signals from these three different kinds of receptors. Okay, so by comparing these signals, they can see whether a flower is bluish in color, or greenish in color, or yellowish in color, or is it UV blue in color, and things like that. Okay. So when we have spectral pooling, what happens is that instead of comparing the signals from these three different receptor types, essentially they pool this in order to get a stronger or a much more, better vision to make the eyes much more sensitive at low light levels. Okay. So the idea here was to test and see whether bees retain color vision at night, which is quite an expensive proposition for a bee, or whether they sacrifice color vision. Now, we know from moths, and moths, as I told you earlier, and as you can see in this picture here, they have the superposition eye, which is quite sensitive at low light levels. And from early work on this hawk moth, we know that they can detect, color at starlight levels. And this is equal to light levels at when there is no moon in the sky, like, for example, on a new moon night. So the experimental paradigm is the same, where you associate moths with a sucrose reward. And then during tests, you provide them with this training color and then with several other colors. And if they're able to choose the training color correctly, that means they've learned the color. And that's how you infer whether they have color vision or not. If they haven't, that means that they have lost color vision. Okay. Now, this was the first animal insect species that was shown to have nocturnal color vision at dim light levels, Dilophila elpenor. So we did similar experiments with bees, and what we had is a rather huge setup, an outdoor setup, and these experiments were not done in the laboratory, it was done in the field itself, where we had, we brought these logs which contain bees, and we placed them behind this platform. Okay, so what you see is a big plywood sort of a board, which had several dummy holes, and one of these dummy holes led to the nest that was behind this plywood. Okay, and we had these two side panels which could be moved back and forth, side to side, in order to hide or to reveal some of these holes. Okay, So what you must remember here is that just one of these led to the nest and the others are just dummy holes. That in a moment I'll tell you how we use this. Okay. So what we did is once we had this plywood, this setup ready, and you can get some idea about the size of the setup. Then what we did is that we trained the bee to associate, a particular color, yellow, say for in this case, with the nest. Okay. So after a few nights of training, then the bee learns that the nest is behind the yellow, and the rest are just dummy holes, right? So they learned the landmark, and then they would readily fly in and out of, through this landmark into the nest. Once they had learned this, then what we did is that we had a test phase. And in the test phase, we had the training yellow, we had 2 shades of gray and 2 other shades of yellow. And then we looked at the responses of bees that were returning to the nest. So none of these colors were provided when the bees flew out. When they came back, they had this choice of colors from which they had to choose. Now, the idea here is that if they have learnt the training color, then they should correctly enter the nest, which is behind the training yellow. But if they hadn't learnt, then they would be making choices for all these 5 colors. They would be making mistakes essentially. So out of the 58 choices that bees made, we found that 24 choices or 42% of the choices were to the training yellow. Okay. The other yellows were also visited. About 57% of the choices were to the other yellows. So what you can see here is that they seem to have associated yellow with the nest color, okay, but not gray, because it's only one visit that was made to a gray color. So just 1% of all these visits that was to a gray color, okay. So they seem to have, what we can infer from this experiment is that they had learned that yellow is associated with the training color. Now, in another test, what we did then is that we had the training yellow and we had provided them with 2 shades of gray and now with a novel color, which is 2 shades of green. Okay. And then what we did is we looked at the choices of bees. So the training paradigm was the same. And in the test paradigm, what we saw is that out of the total of 145 choices that bees made, they overwhelmingly visited the yellow color, okay, the training yellow color, and they rarely visited the green or the grays. Okay. Now these 145 visits were further divided into bright visits and dark visits. Okay. So if you look at the table below, so these 54 visits are just during the darker parts of the night. Okay. So here, out of these 54 choices that were made under relatively darker conditions, 48% of the times they chose the training yellow, and it's just three times that they went to the greens or to the grays. So what these results essentially tell us is the following. In the first experiment, where we had the training yellow and 2 other shades of yellow along with the gray, they chose the yellows almost equally. Okay. So that means that they had learned that the training color is yellow and it is associated with a nest. But they were not choosing, they were making mistakes by visiting the other yellows because they were relying on the color yellow rather than on the brightness, whether it was a brighter or a darker yellow. They were ignoring that fact. So they were realizing between the darker and the brighter shades of yellow, but they never did make mistakes about going to the gray. Okay, so this tells us that they do seem to have color vision. Now the next experiment, whether it was done under darker or brighter conditions, tells us that they chose the yellow colors in most of the visits, and they rarely chose either the novel green color or the gray color. So therefore, from all of these experiments, we were able to conclude that this nocturnal bee has not sacrificed color vision even at starlight levels. So they seem to have retained the color vision even at starlight levels. Now the interesting question is, we've seen the visual adaptation. So the question here is now, why have they turned nocturnal, right? And there are 2 hypotheses that are associated with nocturnality, like transition to a nocturnal lifestyle. And the first is about, is it that these bees that have adopted a nocturnal lifestyle, have they been displaced by competition from day visitors, and that is the reason why they have shifted to the night environment? Or is it because of lesser predation pressure at night? Okay, maybe they experience lesser predation pressure at night, and that's why they have turned nocturnal. Now, what you must remember here is that what we are trying to do here is to ask this question from a contemporary point of view, and we are trying to infer what happened in the past, right? So there is always, by looking at contemporary patterns, we can't really deduce what was the early environment when nocturnality was evolving in bees, okay? But we can try and at least ask what is it that maintains nocturnality in bees, during the modern times. Now, if we were to look at flower visitors at night, we know that, for example, moths are associated with typical flower colors, odors, and shapes at night, and so are bats and also some mammals. Okay, so where do bees fall in this spectrum? Now, if you look at this particular chart, you can see that the first figure on the top left tells you about the flight patterns of bees, which is the percentage exits from the nest on full moon and new moon nights. So you can see that on full moon nights, they have an early evening peak, right, of flight activity, foraging activity, which is quite different from the new moon patterns. In the new moon nights, they seem to make very few flights during the early nights, but most of the flight activity is restricted to the time period between 3 hours and about 6 hours. Okay, so there appears to be a difference in how they fly on full moon nights when it is brighter and new moon nights when it is darker. Okay, then we looked at the duration of these foraging trips because we were observing bees at the nest that you can see in the photo over here. So we can see that on full moon nights, the duration of the trips were much longer than on new moon nights. So new moon nights, they made shorter trips as compared to full moon nights. Now, there are studies in bees and also in other insects, which pollinators, where the duration of a foraging trip is also associated with the distance that they fly. Okay, in this case, we don't know how far the bees flew, but if this correlation exists, this positive correlation between distance and duration, then we can sort of infer from this that on new moon nights, they're making shorter visits and they're also probably flying at much shorter distances from the nest. Okay, now let us look at, so this is, in comparison, so the charts below, if you look at the bottom right, okay, you can see these box plots. And this essentially compares the duration of flights in the nocturnal bee as compared to the two diurnal species. Okay, you can see that in the diurnal species, there's a lot of variation in the flight duration as compared to the nocturnal bees. Now, moving on to the next slide, what we did is that we waited at the nest and we captured the returning bees, like you can see in the photos on the left. And we extracted all the pollen from these bees and then tried to measure, count the number of pollen and what is the diversity of pollen and what is the total count of pollen and so on. So what these charts essentially say is that if you were to look at the numbers of pollen on the nocturnal bees, there was a difference between full and new moon nights. So the nocturnal bee manages to collect much more pollen on a full moon night as compared to a new moon night. Okay, and on the top right, what you can see is comparing the nocturnal species, which is extran over here, with the two diurnal species, and you can see that the nocturnal species seems to carry much smaller pollen loads than the two diurnal species. Now, if you look at the bottom left, you can see that the mean pollen type is just an indication of the diversity of pollen grains on the bee's body, on the bodies of individual bees on a full moon versus a new moon night. Now, what we found is that full moon nights and new moon nights are quite comparable in terms of the diversity of pollen species on single bees. However, the interesting result is when you compare this nocturnal bee, the diversity of pollen on nocturnal bees with the two diurnal species. Here you find that the nocturnal bee tends to have multiple pollen types on its body, during a single foraging trip as compared to the two diurnal species. So from this, what can we say? What we can say here is that they seem to be visiting more species, more plant species or flower species on a single foraging trip as compared to the two diurnal species that seem to be what we call more flower constant. Okay. Now, floral constancy is something that has been well studied in bees, in diurnal bees, and it appears as if the nocturnal bee is less flower constant than the two diurnal species. Now, here this sort of throws important questions about how the foraging patterns, how do they choose flowers, and how do they, the memory dynamics of bees, how do they recall all these flower shapes, and what are the cues that they use, and so on. So all of this is pretty much unexplored, and we probably are, we will have answers to this in the years to come. Now, what I'm going to do, how much of time do I have to wrap up?
We can have 5 to 10 minutes more.
Yeah.
Is it enough?
So can I take another 5 to 10 minutes or?
No.
Okay. Now, here is, I'm going to, what I show you over here in this slide is a particular tree species, which is called Heterophragma. It's a Bignoniaceae member, and it has these white colored large flowers that open at night. Now, there is an interesting phenomenon here, which is that these flowers actually show, there is a movie here, but it's not going to play, I think. So what, these flowers show this interesting behavior where the stigma actually has an upper lip and a lower lip. And when the flowers are open, freshly open flowers have open stigma lobes, the upper lobe and the lower lobe is open. But when a visitor visits, so then the lobes close. So after it has received pollen grains, then the lobes in real time, you can see them closing. And after that, the stigma lips stay closed, and then there is fertilization and, all of that happens. So this provided a nice sort of, what shall I say, a readout for us to assess how much of the flower, how many flowers are pollinated on a given night on a particular tree. So this is exactly what we utilized. And we looked at the stigma states, whether it was open or closed, the following morning, after a full moon or a new moon night. Okay, so here in this figure, you see this is the percentage of stigmas that stayed, that were closed on a full moon, following a full moon night or a new moon night. And we see that there is a significant difference between these two nights, with the full moon nights having a greater percentage or a greater proportion of the stigmas closed, which essentially means that there is greater pollination on a full moon night as compared to a new moon night. Now, we also know from earlier work that, that I'm not going to present, that this particular tree species is solely pollinated by this nocturnal carpenter bee. So essentially what this tells us is that the activity of this carpenter bee is more on full moon nights, and therefore pollination is greater on full moon nights as compared to new moon nights. And it also tells us that perhaps there are constraints, though they seem to be flying, as we know from our activity data, or that they do fly on starlit nights or new moon nights, but yet there seems to be some constraints in making flights or making foraging trips on new moon nights as compared to full moon nights. At the community level, we looked at what is it that these three carpenter bees, congeneric species, what are the flowers that they utilize. Now, what we expect is that the nocturnal bee should be using floral resources that are quite different from the diurnal species. And so this is what we tested here. Now, in this network structure diagram, what you see is that you have the three bees on the top, with the nocturnal bee being the brown bar on the top. And at the bottom, you have all the tree species, 80 odd tree species at the bottom. And there is a line connecting a bee species to a particular tree species if this bee has visited a particular tree species. Now, just by looking at this diagram, you can see that there is a lot of overlap in terms of the flowers that were visited between the nocturnal and the two diurnal species. So essentially what this tells us is that the nocturnal bees are using the same kinds of floral resources as the two diurnal species were using. Okay, now, so this was an interesting result because when we put it together with what we have seen earlier, that the nocturnal bees seem to be bringing far fewer pollen as compared to the diurnal species. And now we also know that they overlap a lot with the diurnal species. Now, what that all of this, all these results put together tells us is that they seem to be sharing resources with the diurnal species, and they also seem to be sort of pushed to the corner because they are gathering, at least in terms of pollen resources. We don't have data on nectar because nectar is much more difficult to quantify how much of nectar they're collecting. So they seem to be bringing back fewer pollen, or they seem to be collecting fewer pollen than the two diurnal species, right? So moving on to the next slide. So this is, the pollen network and the nectar network. And so we try to look at the pollen grains, and from the pollen grains, we could piece together what are the flowers that the three species were utilizing. And we see again that there is a great amount of overlap between the three carpenter bee species. Now, the same thing happens when we were to look at the nectar network. We see that there is a great deal of overlap. Okay. Now, what all this put together tells us is the following, that we see that there are these adaptations that I went through in the first part of my talk, that they do have large eyes, they have large facets in order to capture photons more reliably at night. They have wide rhabdoms and they seem to have large acceptance angles. So all of this makes the eye of nocturnal bees much more sensitive, and it allows them to fly and forage at low light levels. We also know from piecing together their floral use that they seem to be opportunistic feeders. They are not just feeding on flowers that open at night. Heterophragma is an exception. They seem to be pretty much utilizing the resources that the two diurnal species were using. We also know from floral trait data that unlike moths or bats maybe, they seem to be utilizing a wide range of floral resources. Okay, they don't seem to be associated with particular colors or particular shapes. Okay, now this actually opens up questions about how then are they finding flowers at night, right? Are they using odor? Are they using color? Are they using patterns? Or how is it that they're visiting these flowers? Now that is not resolved yet. We also know from our experimental work that color vision is not sacrificed. So they seem to be using color. Okay. Of course, we haven't tested color vision in the context of feeding or foraging on flowers, but we do know that they are capable of color vision. Okay. But it's also likely that they're using other cues. For example, in other nocturnal bees, we know that they do use, in Panama, for instance, we know that nocturnal halictid bees can use odor in order to visit flowers. So these are some of the open questions in this direction as to how do they detect flowers at night, and what are the cues that they use, and how do they actually navigate and negotiate spaces at night? How do they fly back and forth from flowers back to the nest? What is it that they're using to navigate at starlight? So all these are questions that we hope to answer in the next couple of years. So with that, I'll end my talk here, and I will acknowledge, I have to acknowledge, my students, Balu, who did some of the navigation work at low light levels, following them across moon phases. Shivani, who helped with the heterophragma work. Preeti, who also, along with Balu, worked on moonlit navigation in bees, in nocturnal bees. Elsa and Shivani worked together where they were looking at heterophragma and pollination of heterophragma by nocturnal bees. And of course, my institution for funding and all the support from my department. I'm happy to take any questions at this point, and I'm sorry if I've overshot in terms of time.
It is fine, perfectly fine. And we would like to thank you very much, Professor Herma, for giving us a wonderful, interesting talk. And we have your questions, and I have kind request to the audience that we'll be happy to take your questions if you can put the questions in the chat box. Otherwise, if you're gonna open or switch on your microphone, then it'll be going to be very clear. So we have a very first question from Arunodaya Gautam. Can you hear me? Hello?
Hello?
Am I audible? Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, am I audible? Hello, hello? Hello?
Yeah, hello?
Yeah. Can I continue? Am I
Yes.
audible?
Yeah. You are audible. Yes.
Okay.
So I see a few questions here. So I can probably take these questions, right? So
Yeah.
is it true that nocturnal insects, rhabdons are wider? Yes, this seems to be a general adaptation that has been found in many nocturnal bees, for instance. Yes, it is true. We don't have data on too many species, but from the species that we've seen, yes, that seems to be a general adaptation. So the next question is this hypothesis true? I suppose you mean the hypothesis about competition versus predation, right? So I don't get into the predation part here, but we do have some data to suggest that predation perhaps plays a role in in nocturnality in carpenter bees. I'm not bird predation, for instance. I didn't have time to go through all of that data, but it is also hypothesized, not just for insects. It's also hypothesized that it could differ, but competition or predation, is responsible for the switch to nocturnality in other flower visiting insects, for example, bats. Sorry, not insects, but other flower visiting animals, for example, some bats, and so on. But none of this is conclusive. So they're in the stage of being hypotheses.
And we have a couple more questions from other platforms like Facebook and YouTube where we were going on live. So one of the questions is from Sangeeta Das. She's asking, could you please elaborate on the methods and techniques that you did follow to follow the flight pattern of the bees?
Followed the flight pattern, is it? Okay, so maybe you mean the landmark experiments. So these were done in the field, and we recorded the flights using video cameras, and later once you record the tracks of these bees, just the flight paths of these bees, we used infrared light source and night vision video camera to record them. And then later you can use a software. There are many software these days in order to convert the videos into frames per second, and from that you can look at the position of the bee in each frame and then piece it together to get the flight path of the bee or the trajectory of the bee. So that is exactly what we did. So this is a very common technique now, and it is used in studying flight in a lot of animals.
Okay, we have another question from TV Sajeev. He is asking, is there a difference in the activity of bees before forest and non-forest areas?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. Activity of bees before what?
Activity of bees, forest and non-forest areas.
I'm sorry, it's not very audible to me.
Okay, so the difference between the activity of bees, forested area and a non-forest area.
Oh, forested and non-forested. You mean of the nocturnal bee? I guess. Yeah. Yeah. So the nocturnal bee in a forested area and a non-forested area, right? So yes, there is a difference, because we had nests of these bees in open grasslands where there are single trees standing here and there, and we also had them under the canopy. And there is a difference in the activity of these two or nests in these two areas of the same habitat. And we find that the bees in the open were less constrained by light levels, and they would fly even, under, or they would make more frequent trips, even under moonless conditions. But the ones under the canopy were much more constrained, and especially during the darker parts of the night, they would avoid flying. So that sort of indicated that perhaps they have difficulties in perhaps, finding their way back to the nest or navigating under the canopy during low light levels. So, but that's a very interesting question, and we do see that that this happens. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, we have one more question. That is from Sri. He is asking, is this nocturnality is a co-evolved trait with some other?
Sorry, nocturnality is what? I didn't hear the rest of it.
With any other trait?
Is it co-evolved, is it?
Yeah.
With any other trait?
Yeah.
With any other trait. Okay, so I don't know the answer to that. I don't have an answer to that, and we don't know. That would be, yeah, we don't know. We don't know.
Yeah.
So what we do see that they are associated with certain, for example, we can see that nocturnal bee, we do have data that nocturnal bees, for instance, fly much slower than diurnal bees. So perhaps this has something to do with temporal summation that I was telling you. They slow down the photoreceptors, and so therefore they fly much slower in order not to bump into objects or crash into objects. So perhaps their flights become slower at low light levels. So that's something that we do know. Okay, perhaps there are other things, but we don't know yet.
Now I think we can wind up. We don't have more questions.
Okay.
So once again, thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor Hema. We'll be getting back with the compliments of the talk.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity, and yeah, hope the rest of your